The US military is no stranger to controversy. It's been 247 years since the inception of the US, and it has been at war for over 90% of its existence. Some of these wars have caused global outcry due to humanitarian issues like civilian casualties, infant mortalities, and incarceration of innocents. One such event, the Korean War of 1950, which lasted 3 years. What are the dark secrets of this event that have been kept a secret from the public? How does the impact of this war compare to Vietnam and other incidents? And how did it take a toll on the Korean public? We will try to answer all these burning questions in this video. Wait. Before we get too far, we need to turn back the clock to the beginning of the war. This sets the stage for these scandalous events, so be sure to pay attention. The standard narrative is that North Korea initiated the aggression by attacking South Korea in the summer of 1950. However, the Northerners maintain that it was South Korea who, after gaining confidence from US military cooperation, started this war. The world powers at the time, Soviet Russia, the PRC, and the US, don't have clean hands in this matter either. While initially indifferent to the Korean problem, the world powers that represented Marxism and capitalism only took notice when their relations began to sour, when Soviet Russia began to grow its influence into Eastern Europe and Asia. Neglecting the Korean Peninsula's wishes for an independent Korean state, free from overseas influence, the US started investing in the South to re-establish the state under the despotic Sigmans, but only as a proxy against the Marxist governments of PRC and Soviet Russia. On the other side, PRC and Soviet Russia began warming up to North Korea, which resonated with their Marxist ideologies. Now, whichever version of the story you believe, the war starts. North Korea, aided by Mao Zedong and a reluctant Joseph Stalin, invaded South Korea, while US President Harry Truman wasn't eager to enter the war directly himself, resonating with Stalin, who feared direct contact with the US forces may trigger yet another war, and who would want to bear the burden of that blame. Truman named General MacArthur as his commander of the UNC. He was quite an obvious choice, as MacArthur had formerly served as the occupation commander in Japan. MacArthur advised a 3-month plan aimed at composing and uniting Korea. Little did he know that this 3-month plan would become a 3-year-long war with devastating after-effects. You might have seen some foreshadowing in MCU films. You may be surprised to hear that American and Russian involvement in the Korean Civil War was almost inevitable. This was because, post-World War II, claimants to the Korean government were Kim Il-sung and Sigmans Reign. While Kim Il-sung was a Marxist who rose to the rank of major in the Soviet army, Sigmans Reign was an ultra-nationalist who'd been living and studying in the US. A war imposed on civilians. The 3 phases. According to statistics, the Korean Civil War has been one of the most devastating incidents in the modern age. Total casualties are said to have reached 5.7 million people. South Korean casualties are reported to be 1.2 million. Out of these 1.2 million people, 82% were civilians. North Korean losses were estimated to be just over 1 million, and out of these 1 million people, 60% were civilians. A recently unearthed North Korean archive was revealed that North Korea lost 20% of its population in these 3 years, i.e. 1.9 million people. But these statistics by Lieutenant General Razovaev, former military advisor to North Korea, also included 800,000 North Koreans who fled to the south. This means, in the Korean Civil War, the casualties were mostly civilians or non-combatants. In comparison, the civilian casualties were higher than World War II and the Vietnam War, but it is astonishing that this does not get much attention compared to these 2 incidents. This brings us to our next point. The Korean Civil War has been called the Forgotten War by military historians, journalists, and veterans. But this begs the question, why did such a large-scale massacre go unnoticed by the world? There could be many possible answers, but the following are most often cited. 1. Americans in the 1930s didn't know anything about Korea. All they knew was that it was a territory annexed to Japan, not realizing that it had an intrinsic culture of its own. 2. It got overshadowed, or, more appropriately, sandwiched between World War II and the Vietnam War. With veterans just returning to life after World War II, they and the general public chose to distance themselves from war-related news. 3. With TV in its early days, it didn't have 24-hour news channels like CNN or Fox today. Most of the time slots on TV were dedicated to entertainment and marketing. 4. Albeit dark, imperial powers have something akin to amnesia regarding their losses, stalemates, and, in this case, massacres. Though North Korea and its communist allies had a fair share of atrocities committed in the region, the US does not have clean hands either. The war officially started in 1950. Skirmishes at the 38th parallel had already begun 2 years earlier. Stage 1 of this war was primarily a guerrilla war, which the North says was against US occupation, and the South maintains it was against North Korea's incursions into its territory. On the island of Jeju alone, 30,000 people were killed in clashes, and these are just the documented figures. Stage 2 was when the war officially began, reaching its peak in 1950 to 1951. It can be dubbed one of the greatest calamities of the 21st century, tearing up families, creating internally displaced peoples, and causing a refugee crisis with every clash occurring between the belligerents. Although Stage 3 was a stalemate when the negotiations began, the USAF's bombing campaigns against North Korea inflicted unimaginable damage to both combatants and non-combatants alike. Sigmans Reign and the search for mass graves. In 1945, the Korean peninsula was divided on the 38th parallel, forming North Korea and South Korea. South Korea was occupied by the US military, and the election of the initial South Korean government was tumultuous. Capitalizing on the public outroar, the North took its first steps towards reconquering its second half. Coming to power was Sigmans Reign, an ultra-nationalist and staunch US ally. This decision was met with public uproar, but Sigmund's government was no less dictatorial in nature as well. Educated in America, Sigmans Reign was severely anti-communist. Just like anyone in the North would be persecuted for sympathies towards South Korea, conversely, Reign adopted a similar policy of victimizing anyone with Marxist ideologies. One such incident is the cold-blooded massacre of Daejeon in 1950. According to eyewitnesses and military officials, the Sigmans regime executed almost 100,000 people. While the Sigmans regime accused them of being communist sympathizers, some of them were petty criminals and peasants who didn't even know the definition of communism. This massacre would have been kept a secret, but a twist of fate in the form of a typhoon unearthed mass graves in South Korea that motivated Kim Dong-chun to start a Truth and Reconciliation Commission working on bringing this bloodbath to light. The cost: struggles of refugees, cycles of violence, escaping horrors, destruction from above. The biggest crises during the Korean Civil War were the refugees and internally displaced peoples, IDPs. As if being a refugee wasn't already hard enough, the refugees faced other problems, such as continued displacement, threats of being killed in friendly fire or by USAF bombings during the crossing, and many more. The South Korean government was quick to establish refugee centers like Daejeon City. However, these centers would quickly become oversaturated, and the refugees would be displaced over and over again. Being a refugee, they also had to deal with the threat of being executed under suspicion, evident from the mass graves unearthed in South Korea. These mass graves confirmed that the Sigmans regime was equally tyrannical as the Kim Il-sung regime, if not more, and not merely a communist fabrication. North Korea also exacted revenge by executing rightist sympathizers, some of whom were merely refugees and IDPs. South Korea can be credited for providing timely domiciles, escape routes, maps, and rations to refugees. However, their allies, the US, did more harm than good during their bombing sprees in 1950 to 1951. This bombing spree sometimes even damaged refugee routes. Picture evidence of the Korean War shows how the Daedong-gang River Rail Bridge was destroyed, leaving the refugees hanging on for dear life. Legacy: the big divide, and the US takes their side. The Korean Civil War has been largely forgotten in most parts of the world, despite the fact it involved 22 countries. But nonetheless, it has had a multi-generational impact on the Korean population. We'll get to the political scale, but how this war had turned two cultures sharing 1,000 years of heritage and coexistence into sworn enemies is unprecedented. It has torn apart families who now don't even see each other. Till date, the Korean peninsula is one of the most volatile regions in Asia. From a political perspective, this war clearly divided the ideologies and alliances of the two Koreas, North Korea leaning left and South Korea leaning right on the economic scale. This also gave rise to dictatorial modes of government in the two Koreas. So much for democratic, people and republic in both their country names. After the war, both states began pouring heavy amounts to develop and strengthen their military might. The North allying with China and Russia to train their soldiers, while South Korea sending their troops to the US. Both states have also mandated military service upon their population irrespective of gender. As of now, the South Korean Air Force, backed by the US, boasts an impressive arsenal that features the F-35 Lightning and the F-16 Fighting Falcons. In response, North Korea has developed its indigenous nuclear weapons program and is claiming to have over 40 NWMDs. Challenging the traditional interpretations. While the popular narrative has portrayed North Korea as the ultimate antichrist in this scenario, with the advent of social media and a resurgence of leftist ideologies in the democratic youth, traditional causes and interpretations, and causes of the Korean Civil War, have been challenged. People have also started to sympathize with North Korea, and are questioning US intentions and involvement in this scenario, instead of blaming it all on Soviet expansionism. Proxy states. The Korean Civil War was pivotal in war history, as global powers transitioned from head-on collisions to using proxy states to forward their agendas. Undoubtedly, both Koreas served as proxies to the West Bloc of the US and Europe and the East Bloc of Russia and China. Gone are the days when the arch-rivals would meet on the battlefield for bragging rights. They'd now rather sit back and watch their proxies battle it out, akin to bettors in a boxing match. In their own perspective, global left supporting NK, Kim Il-sung rise to power, Stalin's hesitation. Now, it's obvious why the global left would support North Korea, because their ideology would reach new horizons. But apart from that, Japan surrendered unconditionally to the US after Hiroshima, making the US influence and intervention in the Eastern Bloc's internal matters inevitable. To counter an Asian ally of the West, they needed someone who understood the Japanese psyche very well, and who better than North Korea? Kim Il-sung was central in this picture. Although he didn't know his language very well, he was popular amongst the Chinese and the Soviets as a guerrilla warrior and his raids against Japan. Add to that his service in the Red Army during World War II, that made him a popular candidate for the secretary of the CPK. As a leader, he's known for introducing a concept known as Jushi to the DPRK, which is an amalgamation of Leninism and Marxism. He was the one who persuaded Mao Zedong and Stalin to enter the Korean War alongside him. However, Stalin was a pragmatic man. He knew that China had just gained independence, and the North Korean military was still in its infancy. Apart from that, Stalin didn't want to be the trigger of World War III by confronting America head-on. Okay, the war ends. But then what? The war reached a conclusion in 1953, with the establishment of a demilitarized zone and the formation of North and South Korea, but the effects still linger. There's a gulf of separation between the Korean public, who shared this region for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. The torn families are yet to be reunited, and transport between the two states is extremely difficult. The ice has begun to break with Kim Jong-un's formal visit to South Korea in 2018, but the rift is far from closing. Today's left can learn a lot from this whole case study. Although known as the most maniacal, Stalin was the most pragmatic in this case, and was willing to avoid collision with the US in fears of another world war. They can also learn from China's economic policy, which established itself as the world's second most powerful GDP, while North Korean economic policies have constantly flunked. But most importantly, the Korean public deserves a right to self-determination, free from the influence of the US and China, which was snatched away from them as they became proxies for the Imperial West and the Eastern Communists. We hope you enjoyed watching this episode on the Korean Civil War of 1950. We realize that this is a sensitive topic that has been censored for decades, and the details of the war are still being uncovered. We've tried to present this information in an unbiased way. We hope that by watching this, you've gained some insight into this forgotten historical incident. Until next time.